and welcome to Hadassah On Call, New Frontiers in Medicine. I'm your host, Maayan Hoffman. It has been nearly 5 months since the October 7th Hamas massacre, and more information is starting to surface about the atrocities that took place on that terrible day. Remember, this was a planned, systematic attack. The Association of Rape Crisis Centers in Israel recently released a report in which it detailed the sadistic sexual crimes that Hamas committed against Israeli women. This included rape, sexual assaults, and mutilation of women's breasts and vaginas, sometimes at gunpoint, and sometimes in front of their family members and friends. Rape should never be sanctioned as an act of war, said Hadassah National President Carol Ann Schwartz in an interview with the news website JNS. Hadassah members and supporters around the world are participating in Hadassah's global campaign to end the silence, speaking out against the weaponization of sexual violence by Hamas in Israel and by others around the globe. The campaign is mobilizing to demand that UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres advance an unbiased, independent, and thorough UN investigation, in addition to pursuing vigorous prosecution of Hamas for these war crimes. You can read more about that campaign and sign the petition at hadassah.org/endthesilence. That's hadassah.org/endthesilence. This month is Women's Month. About 50% of the world's population is women. According to McKinsey & Company, women make up more than half, 53%, of senior manager or director level positions in the healthcare industry in the United States. In Israel, about 43% of doctors are women and 62% of pharmacists are women too. However, with all of women's successes, rape and sexual assaults still plague women around the world. According to the United Nations, more than 250,000 cases of rape or attempted rape were recorded by police annually. Today, we will speak to Dr. Dvora Bauman, the director of the Bat Ami Center for Victims of Sexual Abuse at the Hadassah Medical Organization, to discuss the situation in Israel, especially in the aftermath of October 7th. Welcome, Dr. Bauman. So there have been multiple reports of the rape and sexual assault that occurred in Israel on October 7th, including the most recent by the Association of Rape Crisis Centers in Israel that came out only a few weeks ago. I feel like before we talk about the medical and the psychological aspects of all of this, we need to understand the severity of what actually happened on that tragic day. Police Chief Kobi Shabbatai said of the Hamas terrorists that they cut limbs and genitals, they raped, they abused corpses, they were sadistic sexual acts. Dr. Bauman, tell me, in your own words, what happened to the women of Israel on October 7th? I understand you were part of the team that put together that recent report.
Thank you so much for having me here. And it's very important for me to talk about what happened. Maybe I start a little bit before. Look, what we call now conflict-related sexual violence is known for centuries, even more. We know one of the first written notes is from the war of ancient Greeks again against Troy. And then when the ancient Greeks win the war, they were, everything. They had the victory there. Then their commander, Nestor, said, I will tell you exactly how he said, none of you will say to hurry and to return to his home before he lays one of the women of Troy. So it was something part of the war. And it's only in the end of 90s of last century that people understand that that's kind of a crime. It's not part of the war. We know war is an awful thing. People are dying, innocent people. But rape and sexual violence should not be part of the war. And unfortunately, although we are about 40 years with this, with a lot of new tribunals and law courts and etc., nothing had been changed. And even more, what happened on October 7th, according to me, and I read a lot of information about it, it's much more severe than ever. I'm more than 20 years in the field of sexual violence. And the brutality and aggressiveness that I saw, not by myself, because that was mostly dead bodies, but I heard from the police and from the first responders and etc. I was in in contact with all the, not all, but some of the first responders, like Zaka. And I heard about women, sorry for the graphics, but I have to say, small parts of the graphics. Women were, young women, adolescent, were raped so brutally that their pelvic bones were broken. Something that I never heard. And after having this kind of information, I went, like we are doctors always trying to see researches, publication, and I was trying to see sexual violence and broken pelvis. And I couldn't find, besides one publication in Africa, that there were a few cases with broken. It's something very rare, and it shows the aggressiveness, and also it shows. I would say that was their aim. The sexual violence wasn't part of the war, as I said. It shouldn't be part of the war. But here they were concentrating and focusing on sexual violence and of humiliating. For example, there is testimony of survivor. She's 94 years survivor, old lady. She is Holocaust survivor, and her grandchild was raped in front of her eyes. So there were terrible things. And if you think like I'm not, nothing military, and I don't really understand military strategy. However, when 3,000 terrorists are invading your country, they could get everywhere. They could get Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and etc. But they didn't. They were focusing, and they were doing something time-consuming in order to humiliate, to broke the spirit of this nation.
Unbelievable. Now, these people come in. I know that here at Hadassah, you haven't had to directly treat any of the victims. And the truth of the matter is that most of the victims who experienced this, from what I understand, were actually killed either simultaneously or directly after the sexual abuse or sexual assaults. But if somebody comes in and is raped or watched somebody be raped, how do you talk about that? I understand that these women are very hesitant to share. So how do you get these testimonies?
So you're very right. Most of the people are not talking, usually, and on October 7th. And we have a big problem, I would say we are the society. It's known, there are publications that when you compare sexual trauma or victims of sexual trauma to victims of any other trauma, they feel much more guilty and shame. And there are, from underdeveloped countries, women that were sexually violent or raped during war, they are then expelled from the families and sometimes killed by the families because they are not anymore pure. So but even in Western countries where they are not going to be killed or something, they feel still shame, and they are, as you said, very hesitating. And that's why sexual trauma causes much more psychological impact. About 70% of sexual trauma, not in war generally, are having psychiatric illness, and they're treated with psychiatric medications. And they have a lot of other diseases as well. And what else is a very common, I would say, side of this sexual violence is what we call self-harm. They are hurting themselves because it's very difficult psychopathology. They sometimes feel that maybe they were, as I say, part of this violence. By the way, there is a Canadian research that the question asked by policemen or interrogator when they came to, to complain on the sexual violence was, in most of the cases, what have you wearing at that time. Okay, so the question shows you that he believes he was part of this guilty. And that's why they feel they are not good enough and they harm themselves. Usually, sorry for the graphics again, usually they do it in their genital area. And sometimes so heavily. We had 1 month ago a lady, because all the story of sexual violence, she was connected anyway to October 7th. She was childhood survivor. But sorry, again, she was cutting herself down so that it bring her to bleed so heavily. We had to run to the operation room. So that's what happens to them. So they don't talk, but their bodies talk. And they will come, even though they weren't in Hadassah, the hostages, etc. But they will come everywhere. And we are structuring here in Hadassah few, I would say, services. One of them, it is like a first responder team that I would say in few words more what means their body talk. They are not saying anything, but they have some kind of pain that you cannot understand. They have the abdominal pain, stomach pain, pelvic pain, headache, and you do all the tests, laboratory imaging, nothing, everything is okay. And the staff of the emergency room knows them already, like, those are psychotic people. They just come and that's it. So we are structuring now a team that once or twice such a patient will come here. They will call this first responder team that will act upon it, that will try. There will be social workers, psychologists, etc. And they will try very, very gently to ask them and even say, okay, we know you don't want to talk, but if you have anything, we'll be with you. We'll go with you to the city. We'll go with you to all the things.
It's really amazing. So when it comes to the victims of October 7th, as you said, they weren't all directly here, but some are sort of coming from things that have happened in the after effects. And I'm sure you're working very closely with colleagues in the field. What is the treatment for the women of October 7th? I mean, what is the goal at this point of a nation, really, or an entire region, at least, that has been traumatized directly, whether it wasn't them that was, again, potentially raped, but they might have watched it, like this grandmother or otherwise? How does treatment look in that kind of case?
So before that, even those that were enrolled, I can tell you that was on 12 October 12th, means a week after starting the war, after the atrocities. The war started on the 8th. On the 7th was the atrocity. I was feeling very nervous, and I was thinking all the time that it might be that there were sexual violence. Nobody talked about it. And I sent like a proposition or an article to some medical sites and to Haaretz. The Haaretz is the magazine, very famous. And I wrote that in case there was sexual violence, then we have to be prepared. We have to, every woman that comes, we don't have to interrogate or ask her. We have to test her, for example, for pregnancy. We have to test her for sexual transmitted infection. And then I got a phone call from the Haaretz editor, and she told me, why do you think there was sexual violence? Where are you taking this information from? Nobody talked about it. And I said, I'm not a journalist. I'm a doctor. I don't mind if first of all, I'm sure there was. It's always in conflict related. And especially if it's Hamas or we know Hamas, I'm sure there was sexual violence. But as a doctor, for me, it's the most important thing is to treat these people. That's why I propose to everyone who is coming or somehow related to October 7th, not to ask her, have you sexually abused or not? Just to tell her and test her for pregnancy, for sexual, and of course, to act with treatment, proper treatment upon it.
So treating her for testing her for sexually transmitted diseases.
Yes, and pregnancy test, of course, for termination and etc. And as you know, in pregnancy, there is a big difference if you do the termination in the early stages than if you get it when the baby is already kicking.
Sure. With the hostages that have come back, there's been a lot of talk about the women that were in Gaza that potentially they also experienced tremendous sexual assault and trauma. Have you heard about that? Are you aware of any situations of hostages coming back that have tested, for example, positive for pregnancy?
I know there were cases of course, of sexual violence or rape, etc. And there were cases with pregnancy. The point is that it's a small number of hostages, right? And the number of women that can be, for example, pregnant is even smaller. We have small children and we have older lady, so the number is so small. And the names and the photos of all of them are in every house. So Minister of Health and all of people who are taking care decided not to talk about meanwhile, because it might impact those women and cause them very severe psychiatric, disease.
Of course, because people might figure out who it was, for example,
Yes,
who was pregnant.
exactly.
Wow, it's unbelievable, honestly, to even wrap your head around, when you say that. So, I mean, is it different? Is rape different when it's like nationally motivated or nationalistically motivated? When a Hamas, God forbid, terrorist is raping somebody nationalistically? Is that a different experience than, let's say, date rape or being raped? I don't know. God forbid, I guess, randomly.
Of course, it's very different. We have seen a lot of gang rapes. And I think half of the interview for the podcast is me asking sorry for the graphics. But again, sorry for the graphics. There are testimonies of 8, 9, 10 terrorists that raping the same woman, she's alive, and passing her over and over and over. And finally, the last one is killing her. And what many testimonies, we have a lot of testimonies from survived people that I would say a very prominent side of all of this. Everybody talks about the terrorists that are laughing. They are doing brutal things and they are laughing and they're laughing and they are laughing.
What are some of the psychological impacts of being raped?
It's a devastating psychological impact. We have very interesting publication. It's a survey from Germany. You won't believe it. It's from, if I don't mistake, 2014. They are doing the survey among German women from Berlin that were exposed to trauma in the end of Second World War. The mean age is about 80, of course. And they did those women who had a lot of trauma, because, war is a trauma, bombing and everything. And they compare it to women that had sexual violence or trauma. And they show up that those that had sexual trauma had suffered from much more psychological problems. Like, for example, they had 80% of them had problems with sexual life afterwards. Most of them, almost nobody had. And it's compared to 20% of problems in sexual life of other women that didn't experience sexual trauma. They experienced other trauma and many other things. So we know that it's one of the devastating traumas. And as I said in the beginning, one of the reasons is that in every trauma, for example, if somebody takes your smartphone, yes, it happens in Argentina, Brazil, it happens, but still people won't tell you, listen, you shouldn't carry your smartphone. They understand that the one that stole your, he is the perpetrator and you are the victim. That's not what happens with sexual rape. There, the people, the society have some kind of accusation. You probably wanted it a bit. You probably didn't. Why didn't you run? Why didn't you shout? And I had an experience, very interesting experience. In Batami, we have men as women, as victims, we take care. And one of the nights, 2 a.m. or about, I came and there was a man. He looked to me, a big man, but he was sitting and he was telling his story. And then I said, okay, I want to check you. And he stand up and it was almost 2 meters height. And probably he saw in my eyes some wonder that, listen, how could it happen to you? You're so big. And he looked at me and he said, listen, I shouted, but the voice didn't get out of my mouth. I wanted to fight, but my hands didn't. So that what happens to those people. They are blamed and they are in total shock. They cannot respond as in any other trauma. And that's why it has so bad impact on their psychology.
How can the community help? What can non-medical professionals do in these kind of scenarios?
I think that if we were talking about, the horrible impact, and because part of this is from the society, because of the society has to stand up and say, rape is rape. You are never guilty when you are raped. It's always the perpetrator. And even more, I would tell you, all the society has to come up, to stand up and say, rape is not part of the war. War, as I said, it's horrible. People are dying, everything. We know it's horrible. But still, rape shouldn't be part of it. And even more, we have again, sorry for the publication, but that's our world in medical science. We're always based on evidence-based medicine. So there is a very interesting work. It's second-degree work, not in medicine. It's in anthropology and sociology here from the Hebrew University, of a woman that the test is called "The Rarity of Rape Among Israeli Soldiers in Israeli-Palestinian conflict." Yeah, and the work is about this thesis is more than 200 pages, and she explains very clearly that I would say she explains that there are 2 types of war sexual violence. One is intentional. It means when your commanders say, as the Nestor, the ancient Greek said, now please do it. And there is a spontaneous. And he says that there is almost zero intentional rape, and we know it. Our army, IDF, they have very clear and rules. And if somebody passed the rule, they are accused, etc., and they're arrested. And even the spontaneous, which is very common in Russian army and etc., this one is also very rare. So it is achievable to erase sexual violence from war. Is achievable. If you want, please come to us and we'll teach you how you can almost erase sexual violence in the war.
It actually leads really well into my next question, because we know what happened. We just spoke about what happened we don't even know maybe, but we know part of what happened on October 7th, and you just described it very vividly. But in general, in Israel, is there a lot of rape? Statistically, where do we hold in society, not just in the army, but in society compared to other countries?
I would say that it's almost the same as in other countries. It's the known numbers as 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men. And my impression that it's much more than 1 in 6 men. It's underreported in all the genders, but it's much more underreported in males. And for example, in Israel is very macho country. The boys are going to the army, they are heroes, they are soldiers. How can somebody hurt them? And those are the numbers. We have quite 10, 20 years ago, also statistical information of 30% of women that they reported of being sexually assaulted.
What role does Batami Center play in all of this? What kind of educational role? How is the center able to help with this scenario?
Thank you for the question. It's a very important question for me, because besides giving the care and etc., we are trying to reach out not only for the victims, we are trying to reach out to all kinds of people that are having any contact. For example, we did a congress here in Hadassah for family physicians and pediatricians to raise the awareness. Again, people are not coming to talk. So just to tell, listen, if you have a young girl, adolescent, that she comes every week or every 2 weeks and she doesn't doing anything of you propose, think before you say, I don't want to see her more, just think that's probably a victim of sexual abuse. Just think about it. And you don't have to ask her. You just can suggest her, would you like to talk with my social worker or psychologist? I can propose you everything, and etc. Okay, so to think, we have it, this workshop, we have it for policemen. Again, the police is improving all the time, but even in Canada, as I told you, the kind of interrogation is sometimes, just putting the guiltness of the crime, and it's wrong. They are not almost reporting, and with those questions, they will never report. So just to understand, to ask it differently, and etc. We're doing to attorneys, to teachers, to all kinds of things. And of course, we as a team of Batami, we are almost 60 people. We are, social workers, nurses, and medical doctors. We are trying to do like excursions to places where the young adolescent of the very high risk behavior in the center of the city on Thursday evening, when they drug people and etc., just to understand who are the people we are treating.
What can the community abroad do to help? Our listeners here are all over, at least North America, most of them women, and probably are listening to this and saying, how can I help to make a difference? Do you have any advice for them?
So sorry, I cannot advise, but I have some ideas. As I mentioned before, one of the bad impact is because you are not always sure that you are the victim. I mean, you is the real victim, and the perpetrator is the perpetrator. It's somehow confusing. And what happened with many humanitarian organizations, and for example, UN Nation, United Nations, Women United Nations, and I will tell you even more important, not more important, sorry, other organization, is that once the war started, they said, we are so sorry for all innocent people that are hurting now. But that's not true. I'm not saying that in Gaza is no innocent people who are hurt. But you have to say there was sexual violence, brutal, aggressive, that. And then we are sorry. And to stand, to speak up for those victims without speaking, again, they say, as somebody's, I think that Butter, I don't remember exactly, that said, yes, but it wasn't in a vacuum. It's horrible, this sexual atrocity, but it wasn't in a vacuum. So it means that when there is a bad conflict between the countries, it is possible to have sexual violence. And others said it's from the university, they said it depends on the context. So it means that when there is some context, there are two, countries that have a big conflict, so it's okay to have sexual violence. No, it's not okay. Rape is rape and not depend on the context. And for example, if we know about, Russia and Ukraine, most of the people are supporting Ukraine. But if today Ukraine is going to Russian village and starts to do what the Hamas done in settlements of Israel, I think everybody will condemn them. Nobody will say, okay, the Russian deserves this kind of sexual violence. No.
100%. So is there anything else you want to add that I didn't ask you, or anything else you want to share that we didn't talk about?
I would say just what is really burning in my heart is that all people together say sexual violence shouldn't be part of the war. No more. That's a crime. And people who did this crime has to be judged and arrested and have their punishment. Maybe if the punishment will be big enough, maybe that will cause less sexual violence in the next conflicts.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bauman.